At exactly 3:07 a.m., the dog didn't bark, it knocked. The sound was soft at first, almost polite, like someone tapping gently on a bedroom door, but when Claire Walker sat up in bed and held her breath, she heard it again. 3 slow, deliberate taps coming from the hallway just outside her son's room. And that was the moment she realized something wasn't right about the animal they had brought into their home only 2 days earlier. It wasn't just that the dog, if it even was a dog, had refused to sleep since they adopted it, or that it hadn't touched a single ounce of the premium kibble Ethan had poured into its stainless steel bowl, or even the way it seemed to follow their 8-year-old son Noah everywhere without ever wagging its tail. No, what made Claire's chest tighten with a quiet, creeping unease was the fact that the tapping didn't sound random. It sounded intentional, like a signal, like a message, and as she slowly slipped out of bed and stepped into the dark hallway, the dim glow of the night light revealed the animal, standing upright on all fours directly in front of Noah's closed door, its head tilted slightly, one paw raised, frozen mid-motion as if it had been caught in the act. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But her husband was already awake, standing just behind her, his eyes locked on the same unsettling sight. And for a long second neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, because something about the way the animal held itself felt wrong, not aggressive, not wild, just deeply unnatural, like it didn't belong in the quiet comfort of a suburban home in Ohio. The dog slowly lowered its paw and turned its head toward them, its eyes catching the faint light and reflecting it in a way that made Claire's stomach drop, not because they looked threatening, but because they looked aware, far too aware. And then, without making a single sound, it stepped aside from Noah's door and sat down, facing them, as if waiting for something, as if expecting a response. "Did you see that?" Ethan muttered under his breath, but Claire didn't answer, her mind racing back to the moment at the shelter when Noah had insisted this was the one. The quiet one in the corner that didn't bark like the others, the one the staff couldn't quite explain, the one with no clear history, no paperwork beyond a vague intake date, and a note that simply read, "Found wandering." And at the time it had felt like fate, like they were giving a forgotten animal a second chance. But now, standing in the dim hallway with the silence pressing in around them and the memory of that soft, deliberate knocking echoing in her ears, Claire felt something else. Entirely, something colder, heavier, like they hadn't chosen this animal at all, like somehow, in a way she couldn't explain, it had chosen them. Claire did not sleep for the rest of the night, and neither did Ethan, because once you notice something is wrong, truly wrong, there is no easy way to unsee it. And even though the animal eventually curled up near the foot of Noah's bed as if nothing had happened, the image of that raised paw and those slow, deliberate knocks kept replaying in her mind like a question she could not answer. By morning, the house looked normal again. Sunlight spilling through the kitchen windows, the coffee maker humming softly, and Noah sitting at the table swinging his legs, smiling in a way that almost made everything feel safe. But the dog was already there before anyone else, sitting perfectly still beside Noah's chair, not begging for food, not sniffing around, just watching him, its eyes following every small movement, as if tracking something important. "Can I feed him?" Noah asked, reaching for the bag of dog food. But when he poured a cup into the bowl and set it down, the animal did not even glance at it. Instead, it shifted slightly, positioning itself between Noah and the sliding glass door that led to the backyard, its body angled in a way that seemed almost intentional, like it was forming a barrier. "That is weird," Ethan said, trying to keep his tone light. But Claire could hear the edge in his voice, the same uneasiness she felt tightening in her chest. And when Noah reached out to pet the dog, it did not react the way most dogs would. There was no wagging tail, no excited movement, just a slow blink and a subtle lean, as if it was acknowledging him rather than seeking affection. Later that afternoon, Claire tried to take the animal outside, clipping on a leash and opening the front door, but the moment the distant sound of a siren echoed faintly down the street, the dog froze completely, its muscles locking in place, its ears twitching ever so slightly, and then, without warning, it stepped backward into the house, refusing to cross the threshold no matter how gently Claire coaxed it. And that was when she noticed something else, something she had missed before, a faint, thin line of fur along its neck that did not quite sit right, as if something underneath had once been there or still was. "Ethan," she called, her voice lower now, more serious. And when he came over, she pointed, but before either of them could get a closer look, the dog moved again, not aggressively, not defensively, just deliberately, shifting its body to block their view, and then turning its head toward the hallway, toward Noah's room, as if reminding them of something, as if guiding their attention. That night, the pattern continued, the quiet pacing, the stillness, the watchful eyes, and when the clock crept past 3 in the morning again, Claire found herself awake before the sound even came, her heart already racing, her breath shallow, waiting, listening, and right on time. The same 3 soft knocks echoed through the hallway, slow and measured, not random, not accidental. And this time, as she stepped out of bed and looked toward Noah's door, she noticed something that made her skin prickle with a cold realization. The dog was not facing the door anymore. It was facing the window at the end of the hall, its body tense, its gaze fixed on the dark glass, as if something on the other side was watching back. Claire did not move at first, because something about the way the animal stood there, completely still and focused on the dark window, made it feel like any sudden motion might break whatever invisible tension had filled the hallway. And for a few long seconds the house was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the soft ticking of the clock downstairs. But then Ethan stepped beside her, his voice low and careful as he whispered that it was probably just reacting to a sound outside. Maybe a raccoon or a passing car. Something normal, something explainable. Yet even as he said it, neither of them truly believed it, because the dog did not behave like it was reacting to noise. It behaved like it was anticipating something, like it knew something was there before they did. The next morning, Ethan insisted they try to treat the situation logically, suggesting that the dog might have been trained in some unusual way or had come from a background they did not understand. And although Claire nodded, she could not shake the growing sense that the behavior was not random at all. It was patterned, deliberate, and increasing in intensity with each passing hour. And that realization only deepened when Noah mentioned, almost casually, that the dog had not left his side all night, not even once. It just sat there, he said, pointing toward the corner of his room, right by the window. And when Claire asked if it had done anything else, Noah hesitated for a moment before adding, "It kept looking outside like it was waiting for something to go away." Later that day, Ethan decided to test the animal, opening the back door wide and stepping aside to give it space, expecting it to run into the yard like any normal dog would. But instead it remained inside, its body tense, its head turning slightly as if scanning the distance beyond the fence. And then, after a few seconds, it moved again, not toward the open door, but back toward Noah, placing itself directly between the boy and the outside world. And that was when Ethan's expression changed, because for the first time he was not just confused, he was unsettled. By the afternoon, Claire began noticing smaller details that only made things stranger. The way the dog avoided mirrors, the way it never made a sound, not a bark, not a whine, not even the soft panting most dogs made after moving around. And, most of all, the way it seemed to understand routines before they happened, standing by the stairs just before Noah came down, waiting by the kitchen before Claire even reached for a glass, and always, positioning itself between Noah and any door or window, as if those boundaries mattered more than anything else. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and shadows stretched across the living room floor, Claire found herself watching the dog more closely than ever, trying to catch it doing something normal, something ordinary that would reassure her. But instead, she saw something that made her heart skip. The dog slowly turned its head toward the front window, its posture stiffening. And then it took a single step forward, placing itself squarely in front of Noah, blocking his view. And for a brief moment, Claire thought she saw a faint reflection in the glass, something moving beyond the porch light, something she could not quite make out. But before she could focus on it, the dog shifted again, breaking the line of sight. And when Ethan walked over to check outside, he found nothing, just the quiet street, the empty driveway, and the stillness of a typical suburban night. Yet when he turned back, the dog was no longer watching the window. It was watching him, its gaze steady and unreadable, as if silently asking a question he did not yet understand. By the fourth night, Ethan had reached a conclusion he did not want to say out loud, because once he said it, it would make everything feel real in a way he could not easily dismiss. And as he stood in the living room watching the animal sit silently near Noah, his jaw tightened slightly before he finally spoke, saying that whatever this thing was, it was not acting like a normal dog, and they needed to consider taking it back. But Claire immediately shook her head, not out of denial, but because something deep inside her told her the situation was not that simple, that removing the animal might not actually solve whatever was happening. And when Noah heard the conversation, his reaction was immediate and emotional, his small voice rising as he insisted that the dog had not done anything wrong, that it had not barked, had not bitten, had not caused any trouble at all, and that it stayed with him because it liked him, because it was protecting him. And that word hung in the air. For a moment, protecting. Because neither Ethan nor Claire had said it first, yet somehow it felt closer to the truth than anything else they had considered. Later that evening, Ethan tried one last time to impose a sense of normalcy, suggesting they all sit down and watch television together, creating a controlled, calm environment to observe the animal. And for a while, everything seemed almost ordinary, the soft glow of the screen lighting up the room, the quiet background noise filling the silence, and Noah leaning comfortably against the couch. But even then, the dog did not relax. It remained alert, positioned slightly in front of Noah, its body angled toward the front door as if monitoring it. And every few minutes, its head would turn just enough to check the windows, the hallway, the subtle spaces where something unseen might appear. As the night deepened and the house settled into its usual quiet rhythm, Ethan made a decision. He was going to test the animal directly, not with guesses or assumptions, but with action. So he stood up, walked to the front door, and slowly unlocked it, letting the faint, cool air drift inside. And for a brief moment, nothing happened. But then the dog reacted instantly, rising to its feet and stepping between Noah and the door with a speed that was not aggressive but unmistakably intentional, its body forming a clear barrier. And when Ethan opened the door just a few inches more, the dog did something that made his breath catch. It did not growl. It did not bark. It simply leaned forward slightly, pressing itself into position as if physically refusing to allow the space to open further. And that was when Ethan stopped, not because he was afraid of the animal, but because he suddenly felt like he was interrupting something he did not understand. Claire watched the entire exchange in silence, her thoughts racing, connecting small details she had tried to ignore. The way the dog avoided going outside, the way it reacted to distant sirens, the way it positioned itself between Noah and every possible exit, and most of all, the way it seemed to anticipate something before it happened. And as she looked at the animal now, standing there in quiet defiance of the open door, she realized that it was not trying to get out. It was trying to keep something out, and that realization sent a slow chill through her. Because if that was true, then whatever the dog was responding to was not inside their home. It was somewhere beyond it, somewhere they could not see. And as Ethan slowly closed the door again, the dog relaxed just slightly, stepping back into its usual position near Noah, its eyes softening but never losing that underlying alertness. And in that moment, none of them said a word, because for the first time, they were not just questioning the animal, they were beginning to question what it might be protecting them from. The next morning, Claire decided she could not ignore the details any longer, because when small things start to repeat, they stop being coincidences and start becoming patterns. And as she stood in the kitchen watching the animal sit silently near Noah, she realized that every strange behavior had one thing in common. It was always connected to something outside the house, never inside. And that thought stayed with her as she slowly approached the dog, crouching down just enough to get a closer look at the thin, uneven line of fur along its neck, the same spot she had noticed the day before. And this time, in the clear morning light, it was impossible to dismiss. The fur there was slightly raised, not naturally, but as if something beneath the skin had once pressed against it, something small but structured. And when she gently reached out, the dog did not pull away. It simply watched her, its eyes steady and calm, allowing her hand to hover just inches above the spot as if it understood what she was searching for. "Ethan, come here," she called, her voice quiet but urgent. And when he joined her, she pointed without saying a word, letting him see it for himself. And as his expression shifted from curiosity to concern, he carefully knelt beside her, moving his hand closer until he could feel it, a faint firmness beneath the surface. Not sharp, not dangerous, but definitely not normal. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because this was no longer just about behavior. This was something physical, something real. It could be a chip, Ethan said finally, though his tone lacked confidence, because whatever this was, it did not feel like the standard identification microchip most pets had. It felt larger, more deliberate, and placed in a way that suggested purpose rather than routine. Before they could examine it further, the dog shifted slightly, not in resistance, but in repositioning, stepping away just enough to guide their attention again toward Noah, who was now standing by the living room window, looking outside with a puzzled expression. "Mom," he said, "I think someone was there a second ago." And that was enough to send a quiet wave of tension through the room. Because although Claire moved quickly to the window and looked out, she saw nothing but the empty driveway and the still street beyond. Yet the dog reacted immediately, stepping in front of Noah once again, its body angled toward the glass, its posture alert in a way that felt almost protective. That afternoon, Claire made a decision she had been avoiding. They needed answers, real answers, not guesses or assumptions. So she suggested they take the dog to a veterinarian, framing it as a routine checkup, something simple and responsible. But both she and Ethan knew it was more than that. It was their only chance to understand what they had brought into their home. And as they prepared to leave, something else stood out. The dog walked beside Noah without hesitation, calm and controlled. But the moment they approached the front door, it paused again, its body stiffening slightly as it looked toward the outside world, as if calculating something, as if measuring risk. And only after Ethan stepped out first and stood there for a few seconds did the dog finally follow, staying close to Noah the entire time, its eyes scanning the surroundings in a way that made Claire's unease deepen rather than fade. Because whatever this animal was, whatever it had experienced before they found it, it was not simply adjusting to a new home. It was watching, waiting, and reacting to something they still could not see. The veterinary clinic was quiet when they arrived, the kind of quiet that usually felt reassuring. But today it only made everything feel more tense, more exposed. And as Claire signed the paperwork at the front desk, she could not help but notice how the dog remained perfectly still beside Noah, not pulling on the leash, not sniffing the unfamiliar smells like most dogs would, but simply observing, its eyes moving slowly across the room as if taking in every detail, every person, every exit. And when a distant siren echoed faintly outside, its body stiffened for just a fraction of a second before settling again. A reaction so subtle that no one else seemed to notice except Claire. "Walker family." A voice called, and they were led into an examination room where the walls were lined with clean instruments and soft lighting. And within a few moments, the veterinarian entered, Dr. Samuel Reed, a calm and experienced man whose steady demeanor immediately put most pet owners at ease. But as soon as his eyes landed on the animal, something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would alarm anyone outright, but enough for Claire to catch it. A flicker of curiosity mixed with something deeper, something more cautious. "So this is your new dog?" he asked, stepping closer, and Ethan nodded, explaining briefly that they had adopted it from a shelter and wanted a routine checkup, keeping his tone casual even though his mind was anything but. And Dr. Reed knelt down slowly, extending a hand in a controlled, professional manner, giving the animal space to react. But instead of the usual hesitation or curiosity, the dog simply looked at him, completely still, its gaze steady in a way that seemed almost evaluative. And for a moment, neither moved, as if both were assessing each other. "Interesting," Dr. Reed murmured, more to himself than to them, before gently beginning the examination, checking the animal's posture, its eyes, its breathing, all the standard procedures. But as his hands moved along its neck, he paused, his fingers lingering over the exact spot Claire had pointed out earlier, and the room seemed to grow quieter in that instant. The faint hum of the overhead light suddenly more noticeable as Dr. Reed's expression changed again, this time more clearly, his brows tightening slightly as he pressed just enough to confirm what he was feeling. "Has anyone told you about this?" he asked, his voice lower now, more focused, and Ethan shook his head, watching closely as the veterinarian stood up and walked over to a small scanner device, one typically used for standard pet microchips. But the way he handled it suggested he was not entirely certain what he would find, and when he returned and passed the scanner slowly over the dog's neck, the device responded almost immediately, but not in the usual way. Instead of a simple beep, it emitted a sharper, more complex tone, causing Dr. Reed to freeze for just a second as he looked down at the screen. "That is not," he began, then stopped himself, glancing quickly toward the door before lowering his voice further. "That is not a standard chip." And the words hung in the air with a weight that made Claire's heart begin to race, because whatever this was, it confirmed that the animal's past was not ordinary, not simple, and certainly not something they could ignore. Dr. Reed straightened up, his movements more deliberate now, his calm demeanor still present but clearly strained beneath the surface. And after a brief pause, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, stepping slightly aside as he dialed a number, turning his back just enough to give the appearance of privacy, but not enough to hide the seriousness in his tone when he spoke. "Yes, this is Dr. Reed," he said quietly. "I need someone to come down here now." And although he kept his voice controlled, there was no mistaking the urgency beneath it. And when he ended the call and turned back toward them, his expression had settled into something firm, something resolved, as if he had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. And in that moment, Claire understood without him needing to say it out loud. This was no longer just a strange pet. This was something far bigger than they had ever expected, and whatever truth was about to be revealed, it was serious enough to bring in the police. The room felt smaller after that call, as if the walls themselves had shifted closer, pressing in on the quiet tension that now filled every corner. And Claire could feel her heartbeat rising with each passing second, her mind racing through every possibility, none of them simple, none of them comforting. While Ethan stood beside her, his posture stiff, his eyes locked on Dr. Reed, as if waiting for him to say something, anything that would make sense of what was happening. But the veterinarian did not speak right away. Instead, he moved with careful intention, placing the scanner back on the counter and stepping slightly closer to them, his voice low and controlled when he finally broke the silence, explaining that the device inside the animal was not registered in any standard veterinary database, that it was transmitting a signal pattern he had never encountered in a routine pet. And that was why he had made the call, not out of panic, but out of protocol, because whatever this was, it fell outside the scope of normal care. Noah, who had been quietly holding the leash the entire time, looked up at his parents with confusion written across his face, his small voice asking if the dog was in trouble. And that question landed heavily in the room, because despite everything, the animal itself had done nothing wrong. It had not shown aggression. It had not acted unpredictably in a harmful way. It had simply existed in a manner that no one could explain. And as if sensing the shift in emotion, the dog moved slightly closer to Noah, its body aligning beside him in that same protective posture they had seen at home, its presence calm but unmistakably intentional. Minutes passed slowly, each one stretching longer than the last, until the distant sound of a vehicle pulling up outside broke the stillness, followed by the faint murmur of voices in the hallway. And then the door opened, revealing a woman in plain clothes, but with a badge clipped clearly at her side, Detective Laura Bennett. Her expression focused, yet measured as she stepped into the room and greeted Dr. Reed with a brief nod before turning her attention to the family. "I understand you recently adopted this animal," she said, her tone professional but not unkind, and Ethan nodded, explaining again where they had found it and how little information they had been given, while Claire watched the detective carefully, searching her face for any hint of what this might mean, any clue as to why law enforcement had been called into what should have been a simple checkup. Detective Bennett listened without interrupting, her gaze occasionally shifting to the dog, observing it with a level of attention that felt different from the veterinarian's, more analytical, more deliberate. And after a moment, she crouched down slowly, not reaching out, not attempting contact, just studying it at eye level. And the dog responded in the same way it had before, still, aware, unflinching, as if recognizing that this interaction carried weight. "This is going to sound unusual," the detective said as she stood again, her voice steady but serious. But that implant is not just for identification. And the way she paused before continuing made it clear that what she was about to say mattered. It is part of a tracking system, and the words seemed to settle into the room like a quiet shock, because suddenly everything they had noticed, the behavior, the reactions, the constant awareness of the outside world, began to connect in a way that was impossible to ignore. Noah tightened his grip on the leash, his voice softer now as he asked if someone was looking for the dog, and Detective Bennett met his eyes before answering, choosing her words carefully, explaining that in some cases, animals were used in operations where tracking and monitoring were necessary. But what made this situation different was that the signal from the device was still active, still transmitting, and that meant someone, somewhere, might already know exactly where the animal was. And as that realization took hold, Claire felt a chill run through her, because this was no longer just about understanding the dog. It was about understanding who or what might be connected to it, and why it had ended up in their home in the first place. Claire felt the weight of those words settle deep in her chest, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping realization that everything they had experienced over the past few days had been leading to this exact moment. And as she looked down at the dog standing calmly beside Noah, she began to see its behavior in an entirely different light. Not strange, not random, but purposeful, almost calculated, as if every movement had been part of a larger pattern they were only now beginning to understand. "It is still transmitting?" Ethan asked, his voice tight with concern, and Detective Bennett nodded, explaining that the signal was not only active but consistent, meaning it had not been disabled or abandoned, which suggested that whoever had placed the device had not intended to lose track of it. And that detail alone changed everything, because it meant the animal was not just a passive subject, it was part of something ongoing, something that might still be unfolding. Noah looked up at the detective again, his expression uncertain, asking quietly if that meant someone might come looking for the dog. And although Bennett hesitated for a brief moment, her answer was honest. She said it was possible. But what mattered more was understanding why the animal had ended up at the shelter in the first place. Because in cases like this, there was usually a reason, a break in a system, a moment where something had gone wrong. As the conversation continued, Dr. Reed stepped closer again, his curiosity now mixed with a growing sense of urgency, asking if the device could be safely removed. But Bennett shook her head gently, explaining that without knowing its full function, any attempt to interfere with it could disrupt whatever system it was connected to, and that was not something they could risk without proper support. And as she spoke, her eyes shifted once more to the dog, studying it carefully, as if trying to read something beyond its physical presence. It was then that something subtle but important happened, something that might have gone unnoticed if not for everything that had come before. The dog moved again, not in response to any of them, but toward Noah, positioning itself slightly in front of him, its body angled toward the door of the examination room. The same posture it had taken at home, the same quiet, deliberate alignment. And for the first time, Bennett seemed to take notice of that pattern, her expression sharpening just slightly as she observed the interaction. "Has it been doing that often?" she asked, and Claire nodded slowly, explaining how the dog always placed itself between Noah and doors, windows, any opening to the outside. And as she spoke, the pieces began to fall into place in a way that made the room feel even quieter, even heavier, because this was no longer just about tracking, it was about behavior tied directly to that tracking. Bennett exhaled softly, then spoke in a tone that carried a new level of clarity, explaining that in certain operations, animals could be conditioned to respond to specific signals, to react to external triggers that others would not notice. And that kind of conditioning could explain why the dog seemed to anticipate things before they happened, why it reacted to distant sounds, why it positioned itself so carefully. And as she said this, Claire's mind immediately returned to the nights at home, the knocking, the stillness, the way the dog had faced the window as if something outside had been present long before they were aware of it. "It is not just being tracked," Bennett continued, her voice steady. "It may also be detecting." And that single word shifted the entire meaning of everything they had seen. Because if the dog was not just a passive subject, but an active participant, then its behavior was not random at all. It was communication, a silent warning they had not yet learned how to understand. And as that realization settled in, Noah reached down and gently rested his hand on the dog's head, his voice soft but certain as he said, "It has been trying to tell us something." And for the first time since this had begun, no one in the room disagreed. The ride back home felt different, not because anything had visibly changed, but because now every small detail carried meaning. And as Claire sat in the passenger seat watching the quiet suburban streets pass by, she realized that the fear she had felt before was slowly being replaced by something else, something heavier but clearer, understanding. And in the back seat, Noah rested his hand gently on the dog's back, the animal sitting upright beside him, alert as always, its eyes scanning the passing houses, the intersections, the open spaces between buildings as if reading signals no one else could see. When they pulled into their driveway, Detective Bennett followed in her own vehicle, stepping out and taking a moment to observe the surroundings, her posture calm but focused. And as they all moved toward the front door, the dog hesitated briefly, its body stiffening just slightly before stepping forward again, staying close to Noah as it always did. And once inside, the familiar space of their home no longer felt entirely the same, not unsafe, but no longer simple either, because now they knew there was more to it than what they could see. Bennett walked slowly through the living room, her eyes moving from the windows to the doors, pausing near the hallway where the knocking had first been heard. And although she did not comment on it directly, Claire could tell she was mapping the space in her mind, connecting behavior to environment, and after a moment, she turned back to them and explained that until they understood exactly what the device was transmitting and detecting, it would be best to remain aware but not alarmed, because whatever the dog had been trained to respond to, it had already demonstrated one consistent pattern. It stayed close to Noah and positioned itself between him and the outside, which suggested its priority was not random, it was specific. That night, as the house settled into silence once again, the same quiet tension returned, but this time it felt different, not like a threat they did not understand, but like a message they were finally beginning to hear. And as Claire lay in bed, she did not wait for the sound anymore. She listened for it, and right on time, just past 3 in the morning, the soft, deliberate knocking echoed through the hallway. 3 measured taps that no longer felt mysterious, but intentional. And when she stepped out of the room, she saw the same scene as before, the dog standing near Noah's door, its posture alert, its attention fixed not on the door itself, but on the window at the end of the hall. And this time, instead of fear, Claire felt a quiet certainty, because she understood now that the knocking was not random behavior. It was a signal, a way of drawing attention, a way of warning. Slowly, she moved closer, her eyes following the dog's gaze toward the dark glass. And for a brief moment, she thought she saw a movement outside, something subtle, something distant, but before she could focus on it, the dog shifted again, stepping slightly forward, placing itself between Noah's door and the window, its body forming that same protective barrier. And behind her, Ethan appeared, his presence steady, no longer dismissing what he could not explain, but accepting it. And together they stood there in silence, not reacting with panic, not rushing to conclusions, but simply observing, learning, and trusting the one thing that had remained consistent through everything. The dog had never tried to harm, never tried to escape, never acted without purpose. It had only watched, waited, and protected. The next morning, as the first light of day filled the house, Noah sat on the floor beside the dog, wrapping his arms around it in a quiet moment of connection. And this time, the animal responded, not with excitement or energy, but with a gentle stillness, leaning slightly into him, accepting the contact in a way it had not before.